Lena Carter sat curled up in her tiny apartment, the dim glow of the streetlights casting long shadows across her weary face. In her trembling hands was a crumpled hospital bill, the number $500,000 glaring back at her like a death sentence. She had done everything, worked herself to exhaustion, sold everything of value, begged charities for help, but no one would. Inside the hospital, her grandmother's breaths were growing weaker by the hour. The doctor's words echoed in her mind, "Pay now, or prepare for the worst." Lena clenched her fists, forcing back tears, but just when she thought all hope was lost, a sharp knock echoed through her apartment. She hesitated before opening the door, and then froze. Standing before her was Adrian Wolfe, the ruthless billionaire, the man the entire city feared. His piercing gaze locked onto hers, unreadable, unshakable, and then, in a voice smooth as steel, he said, "I can help you, but you'll have to accept my terms." The room fell silent. Lena's heartbeat pounded against her ribs as she stared at the man before her. Adrian Wolfe wasn't someone you said no to. He was powerful, ruthless, and always got what he wanted. She swallowed hard, forcing her voice to remain steady. "What do you want from me?" A brief pause. Then Adrian stepped inside, his every movement exuding a quiet authority. She hadn't invited him in, but he didn't need an invitation. His gaze swept across her tiny apartment, taking in the peeling paint, the threadbare furniture, the quiet desperation lingering in the air. Finally, his eyes locked onto hers. "You'll live with me." His voice was calm, unwavering, as if this was the most obvious thing in the world. Lena's breath hitched. "What?" "I will pay for your grandmother's surgery. She will receive the best care money can buy. In exchange, you will belong to me, not for one night, but for as long as I decide." Her blood ran cold. This wasn't an offer, it was a sentence. "You're joking." Her voice was barely a whisper. Adrian arched a brow, his sharp gaze never wavering. "Do I look like someone who jokes?" Lena bit her lip, glancing down at the hospital bill in her trembling hands. $50,000. A number too large, a price she could never afford. If she said no, her grandmother would die. She thought of the frail hands that had once held hers, the bedtime stories whispered in the dark, the unwavering love that had carried her through every storm. It wasn't about pride, it wasn't about dignity, it was about love. She lifted her chin, meeting Adrian's piercing gaze. "I agree." Something flickered in his eyes, not victory, not satisfaction, but something deeper, darker. He leaned in slightly, his voice dangerously soft. "Good. I'll pick you up tomorrow morning." And just like that, Adrian Wolfe turned and walked away, leaving Lena standing in the dim light of her apartment, frozen. She had just made a deal with the devil. What she didn't know was the devil had been waiting for this moment for years. The next morning, Lena stood by the window, staring out at the empty street. She hadn't slept all night. For hours she had wrestled with herself, wondering if this was the worst mistake of her life. But no matter how many times she turned it over in her mind, the truth remained the same. Her grandmother needed saving. A low, steady hum of an engine pulled her from her thoughts. She looked down, and her breath caught. A sleek black car had pulled up in front of her worn-down apartment building. The door opened, and a man in a dark suit stepped out. "Miss Carter, it's time to go." Her grip tightened around the small bag in her hands. Taking a deep breath, she stepped outside. As the door of the car shut behind her, the world she had known her whole life closed along with it. The drive was long and silent. Lena sat stiffly, her hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the passing streets. "You're nervous." Adrian's deep voice cut through the silence. She jumped slightly, turning to look at him. He sat beside her, perfectly at ease, as if this was nothing more than another ordinary day. But his gaze never left her, watching, studying, waiting. "I didn't have a choice." Her voice was quiet but firm. Adrian tilted his head slightly, the corner of his mouth lifting in amusement. "There's always a choice, Lena. You just weren't willing to accept the consequences of the other one." Her fists clenched, but she didn't argue. She hated that he was right. When the car pulled up, Lena's breath hitched. The estate was massive, not just large, but breathtakingly extravagant, a world completely separate from her own. Towering glass walls gleamed under the sunlight, and an iron gate slowly opened, revealing a long paved driveway lined with perfectly trimmed hedges. She was stepping into Adrian Wolf's domain. The grand entrance doors swung open, revealing a vast space of high ceilings and pristine white walls. Soft lighting glowed against polished marble floors, making everything feel even more surreal. Lena had never felt smaller or more out of place. Adrian shrugged off his coat and glanced at her. "Your room is upstairs. From now on, this is your home." She bit her lip. "And you?" He paused, turning back to face her. For a moment, something flickered in his dark eyes. His voice dropped slightly as he said, "I'm always here, Lena. You won't forget that." And with that, Adrian Wolf disappeared behind a set of doors, leaving Lena standing in the middle of a life she never asked for, realizing that she had just stepped into his world, and there was no turning back. The first few days in Adrian Wolf's estate felt like a dream, not because it was luxurious, but because it was a prison in disguise. She wasn't locked up, she wasn't mistreated, but she wasn't free. She couldn't leave. Every time she tried stepping outside, his driver or security team would be there, always polite, always firm. "Mr. Wolf doesn't want you going out alone." Lena realized the truth. Adrian wasn't keeping her by force. He was keeping her by control. The mansion was massive, yet too quiet. Mornings passed with extravagant breakfasts she never touched. Afternoons dragged on as she sat in the library, pretending to read while feeling his presence. He never touched her, never forced himself on her, but he was always there. And every time she caught him watching her, she felt like she was being studied, analyzed, like he was waiting for something. One night, unable to sleep, Lena wandered through the halls and passed by Adrian's study. The door was slightly open. She saw him sitting at his desk, the warm glow of the lamp casting sharp shadows on his face. But for the first time, he didn't look like the untouchable billionaire the world feared. His shoulders were tense, fingers pressing against his temples. A glass of whiskey sat beside him, half-finished. She had never seen him like this before. Before she could stop herself, she knocked softly. "Adrian?" His head snapped up instantly, his dark eyes unreadable. "Why are you still awake?" Lena hesitated. "I couldn't sleep." A long silence stretched between them, and then the most unexpected thing happened. Adrian gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." She hesitated, but then obeyed. They sat across from each other in silence. Lena had 100 questions, but she didn't know where to start. Finally, Adrian spoke first. "Lena, if that night I had asked for something else, not your body, but anything else, would you have taken the deal?" She frowned. "What are you saying?" He swirled the whiskey in his hand, his voice lower now. "I'm trying to understand. You were willing to sacrifice yourself for your grandmother. Why?" She swallowed hard. "Because she's my only family. She's all I've ever had." Adrian went quiet. Something fleeting passed through his gaze, an emotion she couldn't name. Then he stood up, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt as if nothing had happened. "Go to sleep, Lena." She didn't move. "Do you care about me, Adrian?" He paused, turned to look at her. His gaze was sharp, yet conflicted. And then, slowly, he said, "I'm trying to understand you." Her heart pounded, but before she could say anything else, Adrian was already gone. Lena sat there, more confused than ever. She had thought Adrian only saw her as a contract. But now, she wasn't so sure anymore. Lena should have forgotten about their conversation. She should have reminded herself to keep her distance from Adrian Wolf, to remember that this was just a deal, a transaction, nothing more. But she couldn't. She started watching him more, not out of curiosity, but because for the first time, she saw something real beneath his cold exterior. Adrian wasn't just a billionaire. He was a lonely man. That night, as Lena passed by his study again, the door was slightly ajar. She knew she shouldn't step inside, but something pulled her in. Adrian stood by the window, staring out at the glowing city below. He didn't notice her at first. "Adrian." He turned, his dark eyes shadowed, but this time there was no hostility. "What do you want, Lena?" She took a deep breath. "I want to know, why are you helping me?" Adrian was silent for a long moment. Then he exhaled and turned away. "You don't remember me, do you?" His voice was low, almost lost in the darkness. Lena frowned. "We've met before?" Adrian let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "Years ago, you saved a boy." Lena froze. "A boy who was bullied, beaten down, with no one to stand up for him, except you." A distant memory flickered in her mind, a frail boy being shoved against a wall in the alley behind their school. She had stepped in to protect him, not caring about the consequences. But she had forgotten his face. Adrian hadn't. "It was you?" she whispered. Adrian nodded. "I've been looking for you ever since, and now I'm never letting you go." Lena's heart pounded, because in that moment she realized she was never just a contract to him. Lena didn't know when things had started to change. In the beginning, she always felt like an outsider in Adrian's world. The mansion was too big, too quiet. Adrian was the same, unreadable, distant, always hiding behind cold stares and sharp words. But then, everything started shifting. Lena sat across from Adrian in the massive dining room. A luxurious breakfast was laid out before her. Eggs Benedict, croissants, fresh fruit, everything plated to perfection. Yet she only reached for a slice of plain toast. Adrian noticed. "You're living in a billion-dollar mansion and you're eating plain bread?" His voice held a hint of amusement. Lena stiffened. "I'm not used to this." Adrian was silent for a moment before he pushed his plate toward her. "Then get used to it." She looked at him, surprised. It wasn't a command. It wasn't control. It was care. Lena soon discovered that Adrian wasn't always the busy, ruthless businessman she thought he was. Some nights, she found him in the library, not working, but reading. One evening, as she reached for a book from the top shelf, another hand grabbed it first. Adrian handed it to her, his gaze lingering. "You like reading?" She blinked at his tone. It was the first time he hadn't spoken to her with distance. "I do." Adrian said nothing, only nodded before sitting by the window, flipping through his own book. Lena stood there, her heart feeling lighter. In that moment, she realized when Adrian wasn't pushing her away, he was far gentler than she had ever imagined. One stormy night, Lena couldn't sleep. She wandered through the dimly lit halls, not knowing what she was looking for. Then she saw Adrian. He stood on the balcony, staring out into the rain, lost in thought. Lena hesitated. Then, slowly, she stepped toward him. Adrian glanced at her, but didn't ask why she was there. Instead, he quietly took off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. The warmth from the fabric sent a shiver through her heart. She looked up at him, and for the first time, he wasn't a ruthless billionaire. He was just a man she had fallen for. Lena had fallen in love with Adrian Wolfe. She couldn't deny it anymore. Every glance he gave her, every fleeting touch, every silent moment between them, it had all settled deep inside her heart. And she saw it in him, too. Adrian wasn't the kind of man to express emotions easily, but every time his eyes lingered on her, every time he unconsciously stepped closer, every time he watched her like she was the only thing that mattered in his world, she knew he felt it too. Lena had started to believe that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't just a deal anymore. But then the truth shattered everything. One afternoon, as Lena walked past the hallway, she overheard a conversation between Matthew, Adrian's trusted assistant, and another man. "Does she know?" The man chuckled. Matthew let out a quiet laugh. "Of course not." Adrian always does this. Once he gets bored, he'll let her go like she never existed. Lena's heart clenched. She's just a contract like all the others before her. Everything inside her broke. She had been stupid enough to believe that Adrian actually cared for her. She had let herself hope that this was real. But it was all just a game to him. Lena couldn't stay to be discarded. She had to leave before Adrian could throw her away. That night, Lena sat on her bed, heart pounding. She opened her closet, pulled out a small suitcase, and stuffed a few clothes inside. Every step she took through the quiet mansion, every room she passed, memories of Adrian flooded her mind. The coat he had draped over her shoulders, the quiet nights in the library, the way he looked at her like she was his entire world. All of it was a lie. Lena clenched her fists, taking a shaky breath. She opened the door and stepped into the night. She would never come back. Adrian arrived home late. The moment he stepped inside, he felt it. Something was wrong. He strode up the staircase, opened Lena's door, and the room was empty. The closet stood open. The bed was neatly made. Lena was gone. Adrian's hands clenched into fists. He had never lost control in his life, but right now, a fear unlike anything he had ever known consumed him. Turning sharply, he stormed down the hallway. Get every security team on this. Find her now. Lena thought she could leave? She was wrong. Adrian Wolfe was never going to let her go. Adrian couldn't believe it. Lena had left. She had run away from him. He had never lost control before, but now his hands clenched into fists, his breath sharp as he stared at the empty room. He pulled out his phone immediately. I want every security team searching for her. Check surveillance cameras, check airports, train stations. I want to know where she is. He hung up, but the unease in his chest didn't fade. She thought she could just walk away? No, she belonged to him. 3 days passed. No sign of her. Adrian had never felt this powerless. Every night, he sat in his study, staring at a glass of whiskey, trying to understand why this was driving him insane. Without Lena, the house felt empty. There was no one to see in the mornings, no quiet moments in the library where she sat beside him, lost in a book. He had spent his life believing power meant control, but now he had lost control over the only thing that ever mattered. And then, like a crashing wave, the truth hit him. He loved her, not because of gratitude, not because of possession, but because she was the one thing he could never lose. But maybe he had already lost her. With no other leads, Adrian went to the hospital where Lena's grandmother was being treated. As he stepped inside the quiet room, her wise eyes met his. "You're here for her, aren't you?" she asked softly. Adrian clenched his jaw. "Do you know where she is?" She didn't answer right away. She only sighed, watching him closely. "Do you know why she left, Adrian?" Silence. "Because she thought you never really loved her. Because she believed she was just a deal." His entire body tensed. He wanted to argue, but then he realized it was true. He had never told Lena how much she meant to him. He had failed her, but he wouldn't let it end here. "You don't have to tell me where she is." His voice was steady, certain. "I'll make her come back on her own." The next day, Adrian stood in front of a room full of reporters. Cameras flashed. Millions of people were watching live. And in a voice low but full of emotion, he spoke. "I spent my life believing money could buy everything. I was wrong." He paused, exhaled, then said slowly, "Lena, if you're watching this, I was a fool." He looked straight into the camera. "I love you." The entire room went silent. "Come back to me." His voice dropped, almost a plea, "because I can't live without you." Somewhere across the city, in front of a TV screen, Lena burst into tears. She had never imagined Adrian Wolfe, cold, ruthless, would stand before the world just to say he loved her. She wiped her tears, her heart racing. She knew what she had to do. She had to go back. Adrian stood outside his estate, his hands clenched in his coat pockets. He didn't know how long he had been there. An hour? 2? Maybe more? He had told the world he loved her, but was it enough? Would she come back? He didn't dare believe. But he couldn't let go of hope either. And then, a taxi pulled up at the gates. Adrian's breath caught. The door opened, and Lena stepped out. Her face was unreadable. Pain, uncertainty, and something else he couldn't quite name. She stood frozen at the entrance, hesitating. Adrian didn't wait. He moved forward, slow but certain, until only a few steps separated them. "You came back." His voice was low, almost disbelieving. Lena looked up at him, eyes shimmering with emotion. "I didn't know if I should," she whispered. "But when I heard you, when I saw you stand before the world for me—" She trailed off, voice breaking. Adrian stepped closer, his fingers brushing against her cheek. "I was wrong, Lena," his voice wavered, unlike his usual control. "I never told you, but you were never just a deal." His eyes locked onto hers, making sure she saw the truth in them. "You are everything." Lena took a shaky breath, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Then, don't break my heart again." Adrian gently wiped her tears away, whispering, "I'll spend my life proving I never will." And then, he kissed her, not for a contract, not for a deal, but for love. Lena stood before the mirror, adjusting the delicate lace of her wedding dress. Behind her, her grandmother smiled warmly. "You look beautiful, my dear." Lena turned, emotions swelling in her chest. "Grandma, if I had never met Adrian—" Her grandmother gently squeezed her hand. "You loved him even before you knew it, and he loved you enough to risk everything just to keep you." Lena smiled through her tears. She was right. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the aisle. Adrian stood at the altar, dressed in a sharp black suit, and then Lena appeared. For a moment he forgot how to breathe, not because of the dress, not because of the moment, but because she was his. As she walked toward him, eyes locked on his, Adrian felt something settle deep in his chest. When she reached him, he took her hands, his voice low. "I never believed in fate until I met you." Lena squeezed his fingers, smiling softly. "Then never let me go." He leaned in, whispering against her ear, "Never." And when they exchanged vows, as he kissed her under the golden light, Adrian Wolfe, the man who once believed love was meaningless, finally understood the greatest thing he ever had. Lena, forever.